All right. Thank you very much. Let's start all over again. So good to be here. Good morning, everybody. So just some housekeeping notes. This is not the talk about browser injections and JavaScript. If that's your cup of tea, I'm told that's in track 1, which is a really cool IMAX theater. You can check that out. It's also not the talk about the meltdown and memory exploits. If that's where you'd rather be, that's the talk in track 3, which is theater 7. So if you're still in your seats, that means you're in the right room. We're going to be talking about overcoming obstacles in operationalizing security. I'm really, really excited to be here and talking to you about that. So a little bit about what the talk is going to constitute. I'm going to introduce a little bit about me. I'm going to introduce why we are doing this talk. And then it always helps to define the problem, right? So I want to make sure we all understand what is the context within which we are operating and why I thought about talking to you about this topic. And then we're going to go really specifically into some of the obstacles that we are here to talk about, and not just leave you with those obstacles, but also try to discuss what are some of the approaches that we can use to overcome those obstacles. And hopefully we'll have some time remaining for question and answers. So you already heard a little bit about me. So I graduated from Purdue University a little over 10 years ago. And then I worked at a variety of companies that are shown here. So I've worked as a researcher, I've worked as a security developer. I've also worked on the consulting side of things, on the audit side of things. And then most recently did a gig at a startup where, well, at that time a startup, and helped them become a public company as a manager responsible for their security and compliance efforts. And currently, I'm with a healthcare startup, HealthTap, where I'm leading their security program. I also teach part-time at Santa Clara University, where I teach a graduate course in information security. Why do I do that? Because I realize that there is no formal education in this area, and therefore, you know, we all learn from experience. And so I would like to share what I've learned from my experience in you know, mentoring the next generation of security professionals. Okay, so with that said, why am I here to talk about this topic today? Well, so when I joined HealthTap, I thought that, okay, I've seen it all. I've been there more than 10 years. I've looked at it from the inside and the outside. I've worked at companies both large and small. So what can go wrong, right? Except the fact that I had never worked at HealthTap doing the same type of thing that I did there, which is building a security program from scratch. And so I learned a few lessons along the way, and I would like to share them because I realized, I believe I'm not the only one who has ever done that or will ever do that again. And so I think it'll be helpful for everyone to understand what the process might look like. So this talk would begin where most other talks on this topic usually end, which is, you know, we are told that, okay, we need to learn how to communicate risks, we need to get buy-in from stakeholders, and we need to project security as an enabler and not a blocker. That's all good, but what I wanted to convey is what's usually not discussed, which is that unless you have been in the trenches, you wouldn't know. So hence the analogy between MapQuest and Waze. Maybe some of you already got the analogy, which is you may know the direction, right? One of these tools is going to give you the directions to get there, but one of these tools is going to show you the obstacles along the way. And then you can steer your course around that. So the takeaways for you will be what obstacles to anticipate and what trade-offs you can make. So with that said, let's get into the problem statement and try to define you know, what I'm going to present to you. When your job is to start a security program at a startup, typically what does the textbook ask you to do? It will ask you to look at these variables. You need to define your risk surface. Typically you do that by threat modeling. You need to understand what your resources are, which would include a mix of budget, human resources, you know, talent and tools. And then you need to see how those resources map to your capabilities. So that's all fine and good. There is another element here, which is the rate at which these resources change. And they might change linearly or non-linearly. a little bit of college algebra there. So throw back 12 months, when I started the program at HealthTap, I did exactly the same thing. I created like a roadmap, like a 30, 60, 90-day plan, as you would expect. I would anticipate that I would hit certain milestones by certain time period, and that would help improve the security maturity of the program. Classic textbook approach. This was underlined by a linear assumption, and the linear assumption basically works as follows. The prong one is that the resource availability is going to adjust itself based on the risk surface. So this is where your traditional approaches come in. You present a risk report to the management, you walk away with the dollars, and then you hire the employees. That's all fine and good. The second approach is that the capabilities also actually improve in response to the resources that you get, right? Fast forward a few months, I quickly realized that the reality is nonlinear, which is as shown here. If you notice my security roadmap, I wasn't actually able to add resources as fast as I had anticipated to address my risk surface. And that red line over there indicates the reason why. Because if you see in the middle column, I have a few items that are still not in the completed state, despite those periods actually being over. And so what that really means is I hit a negative slope. This is why the linear assumption fails, because the risk profile did not adjust itself, or the resource allocation did not adjust itself based on the risk profile. So if you are starting a security program at a startup, you are going to hit a negative slope, and you should be prepared to first zero it out and then start with the positive. The second important prong is that even if you get the resources that you need, it is not always going to mean that it translates into the capabilities that you need to address your risks. And therefore, it's an important combination of making sure that you get the resources and the capabilities. We will get back to this point about making sure that you hire right and it's a good mix of talent and tools. But for now, you might wonder that when I got this stark reality, stark contrast between the textbook approach and what's the reality, you might wonder if I was scared, and you bet I was. However, I also wondered why else aren't we talking about this, right? And quickly, it all began to make sense. We are all part of the security community, the same security community, just working for different organizations at different levels of maturity. We talk about what mature organizations have done, but we don't talk about the struggles of them getting there. If you are starting a security program at a startup, you would find yourself on the left to the middle of this curve. And this curve can be considered as a bell curve of the relative security maturity of the organizations, right? And so when you are planning for your security maturity, you would have to look at, it helps to get a sense of how far behind you really are. And that sense, that can be actually scary, but at the same time, you got a better understanding of what is the security maturity that will actually be trying to achieve. And knowing where you are on this bell curve is really important. Okay? So with that said, I wanna start with this realization that there's a big gap in terms of the effort required to lay proper foundation of a security program. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start your engines. If you cannot build a Ferrari, or if you cannot build your own Tesla, given the resource constraints, let's start with a Prius, okay? But there is an upside to this. And the upside is that you should consider yourself lucky that you got an opportunity to go through this challenge. Because you don't get a greenfield opportunity every day, and that is where rubber meets the road. So with that problem statement set aside, let's try to dive into what are some of the specific obstacles that you might anticipate, that you might face, and then how would you might overcome them. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is picking your battles wisely. So the textbook is going to throw tons of stuff at you, right? And it's very likely that when you are starting a security program, you're going to do some research. You might even need to catch up on some trends, right? But be careful, because the vendors are going to create a lot of hype for you. There are going to be a lot of buzzwords out there. And so, the vendors are going to remind you of the worst breaches. But keep that in context. Understand, for example, what the breach stands for. If someone, at HealthTab, what I started to do was I started to publish what are called security advisories. I would take a breach, I would see exactly what happened, what was the risk, is that same risk applicable to my environment, and what can we do to protect that? That is the more helpful way to internalize what's actually important to you based on what's happening around you. Similarly, you're going to be looking at tons of alphabet soup. You're going to be looking at, from a compliance perspective, you're going to be looking at GDPR, you're going to be looking at ISO. Again, just because of those buzzwords, don't fall into the trap that you necessarily need to invest more. A lot of times, what's important is you do a baselining, and this is where your traditional approaches will help you. But it's important to do that baselining because it helps avoid duplicative investment. You may not realize, but a lot of these controls, a lot of these regulations are actually hitting at the same underlying security fundamentals. And if you got your fundamentals correct, it is my belief, it is the way I'd like to operate, that if you have your fundamentals correct, you're probably going to hit all those checkboxes. So the lesson here is not every bright and shiny seal is worth the paper it's printed on. I have been defending, various requests for getting one seal versus the other with my management, and sometimes, this is the reverse cycle where I'm advocating them not to spend more money. We'll talk more about how that helps you gain their trust in just a little bit. So let me give you some specific examples of these trade-offs, right? One thing I also like to mention is that you may also want to find if there's a simpler approach of doing something. And the answer is almost always yes. We'll see some examples coming up as well. And then don't ignore the low-hanging fruit, right? Which the things that you can knock off without significant resource investments. And some examples on this slide. So speaking of trends, you might see, attack simulation, red teaming, bug bounties. We even had a keynote on bug bounty earlier this morning. You would have to really understand whether or not you are at a stage where all of this makes sense to you or not, right? So in terms of attack simulation and red teaming, and try to understand what the purpose is. The purpose is if your controls are actually working effectively. But if you don't even have the controls, right, it's kind of like the prerequisite of that is you need to have some controls in place. So why do that investment again when you can wait and see if you have some controls that are operational and then invest in these tools? Similarly for bug bounties, their purpose is to expose vulnerabilities. Ask yourself if you have a process in place to do something with the vulnerabilities, or otherwise wait until that process is in place. Some other buzzwords like web application firewall, DOS protection, you need to ask yourself, is your technology, is your application built on a modern technology with security principles in mind that make WAF type of protection, still relevant or not? If you're already making, if your application is already built on a platform to which the WAF protection does not apply, you don't need to fall for the buzzwords. Are you a likely target? Are you so much at risk of being a likely target of a DOS attack? This is a question worth having. Or are you in a platform like AWS where you have basic protection to begin with, and then you need to start worrying about it when you scale to a level where you are a likely target? So once again, these are all the buzzwords, but we need to internalize our own priorities and understand where we fall. I want to give a really specific example about endpoint protection, because EDRs and threat hunting, this is the rage these days. you need to understand whether or not you need a fully managed solution, or can you do with a combination of manual configuration with auditing. So at HealthTap, while we are small enough, the approach that I'm using is we have something called a user security checklist. So it's not just about the price point, but it's also when you ask the users to do these 10 things when they onboard, it gives them a better awareness of what the risks are, as opposed to getting a device that's like out of the box configured with 10 things that they don't even, are not necessarily aware of. So when the users go through those 10 steps, they get an increased sense of awareness of, these are the important things. And then going back to the security advisory, I regularly publish when a particular breach took advantage of a particular thing on my list that was not done properly by a user, like two-factor or some other example. Going back to that, how generating awareness, I would like to point out that awareness training is almost always going to be an immediate priority. It's just a matter of how you approach it, right? I feel that as a community, we need to give more love to awareness training. We need to do that in a way that actually helps promote security culture. So for example, at HealthTap, when I joined, we were using a off-the-shelf software to do security training, and you all know the feeling. You go through it, you click different links. But what I decided to do was I decided to prepare and deliver that training in-house. And that has had a significant impact on the awareness and culture of the employees, and making sure that everybody is actually aware of the value of why we are doing that. So that's another example of where with a little bit or next to no investment, you can get a lot of value out of your security program. So the next point I want to talk about is identifying your allies and gaps early. So obviously, you would know that you cannot go the whole 9 yards alone, right? That's what the textbook tells you. David asks you to identify the collaborators, identify the departments. But what they don't tell you is, what if the department you really need to get something done doesn't yet exist? Okay, so the answer is, you become that department. We'll discuss some specific examples, but the show must go on. The other thing that you should be mindful of is do more, but expect less to be done for you, okay? So often when you come from large companies, there are specific people responsible for doing specific things, and you are in the habit of delegating certain tasks. But when you're at a small startup, you should be aware of the fact that you may not have too many people to delegate those tasks to. So the textbook will tell you, you have to be hands-on, you have to be an enabler, but that doesn't always mean getting your way. The textbook tells you get the buy-in, but what does a buy-in really mean, right? So my answer to that is impress them with your judgment, and then money will follow. So let's talk about some specific examples of these trade-offs, right? So essentially, the idea here is that you have to chart your own process. When I started, there wasn't a robust enough process for us to be notified when an employee is joining or leaving. And rather than waiting for a full-fledged Workday implementation to be there, I took advantage of simple Jira-based workflows. I tied them into whatever system, wherever a notification is triggered of a new hire, of a hire, joining or an employee leaving. I connected that to like a ticketing system where some tickets will get generated, some spreadsheets will get populated. Same thing with IT. Most likely, you are not going to have a very robust IT when you join a small startup that is going to take care of your identity management needs. That is going to make sure that all the identities are streamlined, all the access is provision and deprovision timely. You will probably need to get up to speed on those workflows. There are a lot of tools out there that can help you with that. But rather than waiting for an IT or an HR system implementation, just be more creative about that and make spreadsheets your best friends, make Jira tickets your best friend, and build some tools around that. How about actually implementing security features and building that in your product life cycle? So you might be used to working with a product manager who's going to write the specification for you and then follow up on that. But the reality is that there may be no project manager. So you have to be the one who is writing the specifications and keep pushing the product team to pick it up. Remember that there will always be plenty on the product roadmap that you are competing with, so you have to stay persistent. In my experience, it took me several months for some of the features that I really, really wanted to go into product roadmap to finally get in. I kept getting, it's going to be the next, and then the next, and then the next release, but you need to keep the pressure up and at some point know when is the right time to escalate. And then, remember we talked about how the resources don't always translate into capabilities. So even if you have funding, you need to get some tools, you need to roll out some tools in your environment to be able to take advantage of that. But if you don't have procurement, what do? Well, going with the trend, you become the procurement. You need to learn the art of negotiation. You need to build the trust to be able to do the right thing. In my example, I did a negotiation for an access control system, and I was thrown into that situation, even though that was not my primary responsibility. But after I had done it once and I did it successfully, guess what? I earned the trust of the management, and now I go in with a request, and they trust me that I have already negotiated down to the most acceptable price. Okay. So the other point I want to bring up is the tension between advice and practice. So oftentimes when we are looking at the textbooks, we learn that training the developers is important, train as early as possible in the process, and making it delaying that is going to make things more difficult for you. In reality, your mileage will vary. The key is how much of an opportunity you have in the software development lifecycle to do a careful review. And no amount of training can actually compensate for the pressures of releasing often and early, which is the DevOps mantra. So I'll give you some examples on how to trade that off. The other thing is the textbook tells you write detailed specifications, get them reviewed and approved before the code is written and the feature is implemented. Good luck with that, because when you're joining a startup, you're pretty much building the plane as you fly it. And a really good metaphor that I'd like to use there is that specs are like guideposts, not gospel. Deviation may be expected. And lastly, the classic example of when to apply or delay a patch. The textbook tells you that do not ever ignore a high severity CVE, but in practice, there may be competing trade-offs. The system may be on a critical path, you cannot afford the downtime, there may be no redundancy. So how do you deal with those situations? So going back to our examples of these trade-offs, with respect to SDLC, you should balance the training with tools. What we did is, one of the earliest things I did was, based on the application security testing we did, we identified what are the most frequent flaws in our code, what are the most frequent mistakes the developers are making. Automate the checks for those type of issues in your static code analysis tools, and then prepare guides, like really handy guides, not like long lectures, that help the developers, first of all, understand and realize that, hey, yes, we are making these mistakes and we need to improve, and that gets the message across very effectively. The other thing I'd like to talk about is, do not underestimate the power of nudge. So there's a thin line between when the employers are, going to when the employees may cooperate with you versus consider security as becoming too intrusive. And so nothing can help, a little bit of nudging can help them even when compared to an army of security tools at our disposal. So for those of you who don't know, nudge is actually an economic concept. It's a Nobel Prize winning economic theory. And even though in this context we are not talking about economics, but it's still relevant to the ROI on your security investments. So I'll give you an example. DLP reminders. So although I believe that a DLP tool isn't necessarily making a significant contribution towards improving my security baseline, however, the DLP tool has this nudge factor. Every time we detect sensitive information being shared, which we don't know is with a user who actually has a purpose to receive that or not, we send a reminder to the user that, hey, please take a look. Is this information really necessary to be shared with this person? And with this way, with this nudging, it gradually will inculcate an awareness in our employees that they have to be careful every time they are taking that step. And that's also a good compromise between clamping down on all sharing versus making sure that your user base is educated on proper awareness. One thing I would like to also emphasize is it's okay to give unsolicited advice. You are working in an environment where the feedback loops are not streamlined. There isn't enough opportunity for the teams to recognize or to request help. Therefore, don't be afraid to offer advice when needed. If the spec has holes, go ahead and fill them. There isn't going to be a security checklist waiting for you to put your stamp of approval on. It's up to you to insert it where it's needed. You know the best where security checks are needed and make sure that you provide that advice at the right time. And lastly, on the topic of when or when not to apply a critical fix, the idea is that if it cannot go in immediately, make sure that you are monitoring it. And monitor the known vulnerable systems more closely. It is a reality. You will be running with some % of vulnerable systems. You cannot be not vulnerable at all times. So continue to identify the first available opportunity to fix them. And then my last topic is going to be buy what you must and build what you can. This is kind of like the most common sense of all the topics that we've talked about, where the textbook comes fairly close to reality, but there are just a few things that the textbook doesn't quite lay down for you. So there's always going to be a right combination of tools, talent, and training. What I really wanted to emphasize is don't be afraid to go with modern or newer vendors. Because oftentimes there's a tendency to think that only the established and entrenched players are the ones that you want to go for. But with startups, there are two reasons why that may or may not always work out. They may have some, they may have like a lower limit of like at least how big of a company they want to work with, and you'll be out of luck there. Secondly, discuss your use case with them, and you may be surprised that vendors can sometimes be unbiased consultants or advisors. I've had this experience where the vendor would very frankly talk about their own technology and say that, hey, we are using all these buzzwords. This part of it may not be true, may be exaggerated, but this is our real value. So, and oftentimes, I know that we want to stay away from talking to salespeople, but if you're looking at a smaller vendor, you may find yourself talking to engineers. You may find yourself talking to even the CEO, and you can have a really candid discussion. And I have personally really taken advantage of that fact. So don't shy away from doing that. The other is to put things between the DIY versus the buy buckets. Again, it's kind of like a common sense thing, but the point that I wanted to bring across here is that make sure that you take into account when you onboard a tool, make sure that you have the resources, you have the right kind of talent to support that, or make a decision between the tool that has just enough capability to keep you going, right, that comes with the built-in features, and then you have the remaining amount of resources on hand to kind of fine-tune that tool. So, for example, if you're making an investment into an open source tool, or rather, if you're not making an investment and using an open source tool, then you'd have to make an investment into the human resource. But if you don't have a human resource, then you would go with something that gives you a little bit to get started with, to chew on, and then have someone that can take it from there. So that's kind of like a common sense thing, but I just wanted to touch upon that in case that doesn't get ignored. And it's important to know where technology will give you advantage. So automate where technology will give you advantage, and then rely on manual efforts where it's best suited. For example, security analytics or pen testing type of work. And a few examples right here would be when we were looking at our intrusion detection system, we wanted to see what's the most cost-efficient way. So one way for you to do that is to not have all of the raw data being fed into your SIEM. Maybe use another service that's going to give you, an analyzed feed of threats, and then you can direct that feed into your SIEM. Similarly, for mobile device management, I was not a fan of the huge service and implementation fee that the large vendors charge, and so I'm inclined to go towards a system where, once again, going back to the user security checklist, you have a trust but verify approach. And so, you would trust the users to do the right thing, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you can audit them frequently enough, and while you're at a scale where it can still be effective. And lastly, identity management. Are you one of those environments that absolutely don't want to have AD in your ecosystem? If you're in Google Cloud, go with a cloud-based LDAP that connects directly with the identity store. And if you are cognizant of the per user and implementation fee for having an identity system for entire organization, focus on the most critical subsets first. So, for example, I took a turn on that, and instead of starting with the whole company first, I started to focus on just the engineering team and just focusing on the infrastructure, and decided to go with a vendor that is going to help me with the infrastructure first, and then that can be expanded to the whole company. And that really brings a lot of cost savings for everybody. So I think with that, I would take a pause and see if there are any questions, but thank you so much for being here today. Oh, there is a question. Okay. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Yeah, so I think the question is, with after all that education, how are you going to improve on the hiring and retention? So that is something that again is part of the non-linear nature of building a security program, and that is something a little bit more on the personal side of things than what you can put in terms of practical steps to directly affect the security maturity of the program. But the hiring and retention obviously is a challenge for all security, for all companies, particularly in the Bay Area. But I mean, to that effect, I would say that having the right balance of tools and resources on your team, and making sure that it's not one person's job to be the end-to-end a soldier for every single thing. That for me it has been something that I've noticed as a red flag. So don't burn them out, and then making sure that you are going back to what I said about creating incentives. So making sure that employees are incentivized for bringing forward good security practices. But at the end of the day, I mean, it is a key challenge. Hiring and retention is something that is kind of like a broader thing than just limited to a security program. So, but as a security team, you can do a lot of things by making sure that you are not overburdening any single employee with a lot of responsibilities, and making sure that you can hire right, making sure that they are passionate about the role that they are doing, and you can do a lot of that planning. But it's unfortunately something where the results are not always guaranteed. I think there's one more question. Yeah. That's a great question. The ratio of junior versus senior is something that is a really critical piece. And on my team right now, the people who are dedicated to security are relatively junior, but the people that are indirectly helping security but are not dedicated to security are senior people. So I would, and again, hiring senior people in security, going back to the previous question, is going to be challenging for a small startup. And therefore, leveraging as much as you can from senior people that are not directly on part of the security team is going to be very helpful. So for example, your DevOps team, make sure they are your best friends. One of the first things I did was, make strong connections with the lead DevOps person and make sure that they are aware that how every move they are making directly or indirectly impacts security. And therefore, to answer that question, yes, it's going to be a challenge to have a lot of senior people in security on your team directly, but make sure that you have good connections with senior people in related areas like DevOps and engineering, and make them indirectly part of your security agenda. All right. I think I'm the last one standing between you and the lunch, so I'll let you go and have some lunch. Thank you so much. It's been awesome talking to you.
Okay, thank you, Rafae. And in the name of the Adobe and BSides, let me give you this. Thank you.